Good afternoon, everybody. If I could last a few people to take your seats, that would be wonderful. Can everybody hear me? Does that sound right? Great, thank you. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Gabe Scheinman, and I'm the Executive Director of the Alexander Hamilton Society. And I'd really like to welcome both members of the press, students, alumni, faculty, and friends of AHS for what I know, not just hope, but know will be an informative and lively conversation. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. First, just so everyone's aware, we're being broadcast live on C-SPAN. Second, please turn your phones to silent or off if you haven't done so already. Third, to members of the press, there's a conversation, and Dan, our erstwhile host, will do Q&A, but if the members of the press could actually hold their questions to the very end, we'll be sure to actually leave a few minutes for the press to actually ask questions while everybody's still seated. And then finally, to our students who are in the audience, Ambassador Bolton has agreed to do a picture at the very, very end. So please, when we finally dispersed, please come quickly to the stage so we can do that before Ambassador Bolton heads off. So thanks for that. For those of you who don't know, the Alexander Hamilton Society is a nonprofit, nonpartisan national organization that fosters constructive debate on basic principles and contemporary issues in American foreign, economic, and national security policy. AHS members share a conviction that the world is a better, safer, and more prosperous place when the United States is willing and able to lead. They recognize that our true friends and most reliable partners in the world are fellow democratic nations, and they appreciate the commitment needed to maintaining both the moral authority and the material strength on which that leadership rests. Initially, through our student-led college chapters across the country, of which we have a number of our student leaders here today, AHS seeks to identify, educate, and launch men and women into the foreign policy and national security world by promoting debate on critical issues where there often isn't any. Over 10,000 students attend our close to 40 college campuses annually, and even in our young age, many of our alumni and faculty are and have served in the upper reaches of the U.S. government. To learn more about what we do, please come up to me or a number of members of my staff, or you can visit www.alexanderhamiltonsociety.org. Before we begin, I'd actually just like to say a word about the attack in Pittsburgh over the weekend. I'm sure many of you have been touched personally by this tragedy. A family member of a close friend of mine was among the victims. Anti-Semitism is not only the world's oldest hatred, but also a genocidal one. It seeks the complete destruction of the Jewish people. And the attack on the Eitz Chaim synagogue in Pittsburgh was an act of terror that really struck at the heart of what makes America so exceptional, which is the right to practice one's religion freely without fear of persecution. And in America, in this country, we're really blessed that our government is the champion, the guarantor, and the protector of such right. Whereas in other countries, whether it be China, Iran, or Burma, or even the so-called Islamic State, it's the regime that actually threatens, outlaws, and even murders those who try and exercise it. And this foundational right really is one of what being an American is essentially about and not afforded to most in the world. And to understand how far the ripples of this American exceptionalism can reach, I can only point to an alumnus of our organization who's actually here at the speech, Sheikh Atiri, a young Iranian dissident who started an online GoFundMe campaign that has thus far raised close to $1 million for the Eitz Chaim synagogue. And so at a difficult, I think it's, at a difficult time for our country, it's stirring not only to see the outpouring of support, but also the defiance that evil will not win. And so thus, to me, it's really commendable to see that the administration's national security strategy, which is really the topic of today's conversation, also recognizes how critical freedom of worship is to the national security of the United States. And to quote from the NSS, the United States remains committed to supporting and advancing religious freedom, America's first freedom. Our founders understood that religious freedom not as the state's creation, but the gift of God to every person and a fundamental right for our flourishing society. And so while I suspect the conversation will delve on some of the more traditional issues and threats to American security and American leadership, no nation that threatens the United States does not also threaten that first freedom. So before I introduce our guest of honor, let me introduce first our host, my friend and colleague, Dan Blumenthal. Dan is the Director of Asian Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, a scholar on Sino-American relations and East Asian security issues. He's a former Pentagon official, and perhaps most importantly, both to me, he's the founder, one of the founders and visionaries behind the Alexander Hamilton Society. Finally, it is my honor to welcome Ambassador John Bolton, Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs. And this is actually a lesson for all our students in the audience who at the beginning of their careers, that even at the highest levels of national security and foreign policy roles in the US government, you remain either a secretary or an assistant. And so Ambassador Bolton has served under 4 US presidents for nearly 20 years of public service. Prior to this role, most recently as the US Permanent Representative to the United Nations during the George W. Bush administration. He's just recently returned from a trip to Russia and the Caucasus, where he made some news, but what was less, I think, widely reported is he also laid a wreath at the site of the assassination of liberal Russian politician and Putin critic Boris Nemtsov, who was murdered in 2015. And most importantly, again, to me, he was a longtime member of the AHS Board of Advisors, traveled to a number of campuses to speak to our students about the importance of principled and powerful American leadership in the world. And so with that, thank you for your service to the country, your service to the President, your service to the Hamilton Society. And gentlemen, please, the stage is yours. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon.
Glad to be here.
Happy Halloween. I see, most importantly, you've kept your mustache despite the unrelenting pressure on you, and it just shows a lot about your spine and so on. So
yeah, it had turned white a long time ago, so there wasn't much more to do.
Okay. I thought we would start off by, since we have so many students here and aspiring foreign policy hands, by asking more of a kind of generic career advice question, which is, things have changed so much since you entered the field. What do you think has fundamentally changed now, and what are some of the promises for some of our students, and what are some of the challenges that you didn't have to face?
Yeah. Well, I started off as a lawyer, so there's no better way to get into foreign policy than to do something else for a long time. But I think really for those who are interested in international affairs, this is a better time than there's ever been before. There didn't really used to be too much alternative between simply joining the Foreign Service at the State Department or joining the military and serving in posts overseas. But now I think American business is so international that you have a much better opportunity to have a variety of career choices. I think where the government still fails, however, is in not encouraging and allowing movement back and forth between the government and the private sector. I think that that this would enhance both the government and the private sector if there was more movement back and forth. But it's a very hard culture to overcome, and not one you can reverse overnight. But from the perspective of dealing with all kinds of international issues, the opportunities today are really much broader for younger people.
In terms of government service, I mean, a lot of people, I think, don't know this about you, but the breadth of government experience you've had, from being a lawyer in the Justice Department to being involved with the first Gulf War and writing the actual ceasefire resolution, and then moving on to the W administration as Undersecretary of State, and now National Security Advisor. What has changed the most in government since you've last been in?
Well, I think it's gotten more bureaucratic, more sclerotic, harder to get things done. It's just, it's really depressing to see the difficulty that we have in making decisions, even complex decisions. It seemed to me in days gone by were decided more rapidly. And I think the number of things that require coordination that prevent rapid, effective decision making has become more and more difficult. I think another related issue is how hard it is for people from the outside to come into the government. The excessive nature of the so-called ethics checks, the kinds of investigations that people have to go through. If you were designing a system to discourage people from coming into the government, you would do it exactly this way. And that risks building up a priestly class of people who only serve in the government, particularly when it comes to policy. So I believe that the virtue of American society historically has been fluidity, flexibility, the ability to move geographically and between jobs. And to the extent you wall government off from the rest of society, I think you make a big mistake.
Are there any fixes for this?
Well, I think part of what needs to happen is a Congress that's more willing to allow for the executive branch to make decisions that increase flexibility and reduce bureaucracy, that give the president greater authority to move budget levels around within departments and even between departments. I don't think that's very likely to happen. But if you'll recall, in Federalist number 70, Alexander Hamilton said that the characteristic of the executive branch was decision, activity, secrecy, and dispatch. Does anybody think that sounds like our federal government today? And it certainly doesn't sound like Congress. And this is a real problem. It's a real problem. It's a problem internationally. It's a problem domestically as well.
Moving on to the national security strategy and your role in implementing it, one of, I think, the great innovations or transformations has been in the initial national security strategy was to actually name China and Russia as revisionist great powers and to say we're in an era of great power competition and we're going to compete more vigorously. And of course Iran also was mentioned perhaps at more of a regional power, but how have you seen that play out, and what would you like to do to carry that competition more vigorously forward?
Well, and don't forget North Korea as a threatening regional power as well. Look, I think the most important thing is to be able to think strategically to begin with, to understand that other powers in the world have their own plans, have their own interests, and are implementing them. We're not simply observing something and occasionally running into a problem. There are countries that have interests that are fundamentally adverse to ours that we have to deal with. That's not to say that you don't seek areas for cooperation. I think that's all to the good. Nobody's looking for ceaseless competition. But to believe that history has ended, as people said about 30 years ago, that geopolitical conflict has disappeared, that we're purely in an era of economics, is all fundamentally wrong. I don't want to say that we're back in the 19th century. We may be back in some century before that, with far more lethal weapons available to the parties involved. And unless you're prepared to protect the United States' interest by having our own strategy to deal with countries whose adverse interests become more and more apparent, we will suffer one setback after another. And I think being able to think in those strategic terms is critical. Otherwise, you're doing nothing but ad hoc reacting to one event after another.
So in terms of really difficult geopolitical questions, and I think you raised some of this in your last trip with the Russians when you informed them of our intent to leave the INF. But the question of China and Russia getting too close or casting them in, as they both are strategic competitors, I think that's just a fact. But you mentioned to the Russians that perhaps we should talk about China. I believe that's what was reported.
And occasionally press reports are correct.
Right, okay,
That happens to be one.
Good. I wanted to check.
It's always worth it.
Right. What was reported is that you mentioned to the Russians, who obviously weren't happy about our informing them on the INF treaty, that perhaps we should talk about the China threat.
If you look at the geography and demography of East Asia, in the case of Russia, you have a country with a huge land mass, very substantial mineral resources, and a very small population. To its south is a country with constrained land mass, short on resources, and a very large population. And so one has to ask the Russians how long that situation will exist without them being in a potentially difficult position. So I think this question of looking, for example, in the case of the intermediate range nuclear capable ballistic missiles, our estimate is somewhere between 33 and 50% of China's missiles fall into that category. None of them can reach the United States. and we all have our issues with countries on our southern border. Russia's issues are a little bit more acute than ours are. So I think this is a matter for Russia to take very seriously, and it's something I think we should take very seriously too.
Do you see any evidence that those two great powers are cooperating too much for your liking?
Well, I wouldn't exaggerate it. I mean, in many respects, they're on the other side of some of the most important transactions. Which necessarily means that while their interests appear to coincide, in fundamental terms they don't. Russia is an exporter of hydrocarbons, and China is a major importer. Russia sells advanced weapon systems, and at least so far China buys advanced weapon systems, although I have complete confidence that they're doing to the Russians the same thing they do to many American products and businesses. They're stealing their intellectual property, they're copying it, they're duplicating it, and pretty soon they'll sell the same weapon systems at prices lower than the Russians sell.
Well, cooperating on Russia in terms of stopping IP theft would be a true innovation, I think. But the other danger, of course, is if China and Russia and Iran Russia and Iran obviously do cooperate, but if three of those stated revisionist powers actually start to cooperate more, and I don't think you see too much evidence of that, but is it a concern?
Well, I think one of the linkages between the strategic competitors of Russia and China and the issues of Iran and North Korea really do coincide in many respects, and it's so important in dealing with North Korea and dealing with Iran is that although the proliferation threats are more important, they have significant ties to the strategic threats as well. One day, history will tell us exactly how much of a contribution China and Russia made, respectively, to the North Korean and Iranian nuclear weapons and ballistic missile programs. We have a certain amount of evidence, we can speculate on it, but a lot of these problems of proliferation derive initially from great power competition. The nuclear capabilities, for example, of India and Pakistan going back to Cold War days stem in part from Russia-Chinese rivalry back then. And in the case of Pakistan, we know from what we learned from the Libya nuclear weapons program that the weapons design that the great proliferator entrepreneur A.Q. Khan was selling around had Chinese markings on them. Right. So there's a lot of commonality between the proliferators, the rogue states, the regional threats, and what they derived over time from the global powers too.
Yeah, that's an important point. Do you see so much of the North talks about North Korea have to do with their own strategic forces and their threats to employ them against South Korea and Japan, but the proliferation threat, I would imagine, has not gone away. Generally speaking, in terms of global proliferation and countries proliferating and networks proliferation, how much difference do you see now from when you were last in government in charge of those very issues?
I think the risk of proliferation and proliferation markets remains very high, and it's endemic in proliferation itself. As each new power gets a nuclear capability, the incentive of neighboring powers or others who have hostile interest grows mathematically. So the effort to stop proliferation, to stop North Korea's nuclear program, is not just to deal with the threat of North Korea, but with the possibility of the onward transfer of both nuclear technology and actual nuclear weapons. And to stop Iran before it gets to that point has implications not only in the Middle East and what Iran's capabilities are, but the risk that they would also transfer it in the future.
The National Defense Strategy, which obviously was a corollary or even a support document to the National Security Strategy, really prioritized. And Secretary Mattis said China is far and away our near peer competitor that we have to shape a military to face and compete with and stop them from doing things we don't like. Russia was up there. It put terrorism a little further down. How do you think about that?
Well, I think it's because it's a strategy paper. You ought to look primarily at the strategic level. And I think the importance of all of these things that were written before I joined the government, and which I'm perfectly content to leave as written because I think they were well done, is to be able to plan over a longer period of time. And too often in the government, one problem, as the cliche goes, is that the urgent crowds out the important. It's not that terrorism has ceased to exist as a threat. There's a lot of reason to believe that in many respects it's become more difficult to find, that the dangers are really continuing to grow, and in the perfect storm where the terrorists get weapons of mass destruction, that threat really remains. If anything, what I think we're saying is that the spectrum of threats has grown, and that the day we could say, well, there are no threats from other great powers that existed for a short time in the blissful 1990s after communism collapsed was not true then, although people didn't perceive it. It's certainly not true now. So you have a range of threats from the more particularistic terrorist threat right up to great power competition and everything in between. That's why there's such strain on resources and a strain on budget to correct for 8 years of underspending, dramatic underspending under Obama, is still very difficult to do, even for an administration that's determined to try and make the military whole again.
So on that topic, on the military budget, there certainly was a plus up for the last for the coming fiscal year and for the last fiscal year, but now there's some talk about going back down after that. How seriously should we take that talk? Are you satisfied with where the military budget is headed, given these things?
Well, the President's budget guidance is that everybody's going to cut 5%, or at least the aggregate cut is going to be 5%. And of course, some of the howls of outrage are already coming from various parts of the government. You know, it is a fact that when your national debt gets to the level ours is, that it constitutes an economic threat to the society. And that kind of threat ultimately has a national security consequence for it. It just has to be that we can constrain government spending in ways that allow us to spend on the priorities we need to. So I think in the budget that OMB is crafting right now, you're going to see significant spending cuts, not in the entitlement programs, because in the near term, the budget deficit problem is in the discretionary spending. The entitlements come in a few years, and that problem is going to have to be addressed. But right now, you can have significant impact on both the deficit and the national debt by cutting government spending on the discretionary programs.
What do you think that'll do to the defense budget over the course of 4 or 5 years?
Well, I think in the near term, it's going to flatten out. I don't think there's much question about that. I think the President's put a lot of emphasis, and the Defense Department's put a lot of emphasis on things like procurement reform, and finding ways to reduce costs across a wide variety of areas. I think in the Reagan years, when there was a big defense buildup, there was perhaps not so much emphasis on cost cutting and taking costs out. I think that is a difference here. So hopefully, although the budget may not be in an upward curve, the effective spending of the money will increase.
Let's switch gears a little bit. It's related, but you've had to, I imagine one of the biggest changes that you've had to address is the cyber world. And you've said some things about, and I think have a new strategy out about a new approach to cyber, and feeling like the last administration was too defensive in their approach. And can you say a little bit more about that? How do we deter? How do we think about deterrence in the cyber realm?
Right. Well, we've just recently published the first comprehensive federal government cyber strategy. But even before that, we issued a directive which is classified, and so
therefore you can't say much about it.
Therefore, I'm only going to say the really good parts. That effectively reversed the Obama administration view on offensive cyber operations. This was a case of reducing the procedural restrictions on undertaking offensive cyber operations. It doesn't mean that it's a no-holds-barred environment. There are still decision-making channels that we go through. And I think very carefully protected channels, but the gridlock, the inability to do anything effectively, has been eliminated. And I think that's critical, because I think if our adversaries can take steps against us in cyberspace and feel no consequences, feel no pain, bear no cost, they have no incentive to stop attacking us in cyberspace. Now, the objective here is not to have unrestricted cyber warfare. The objective is to create structures of deterrence by making our adversaries understand that when they engage in offensive cyber activities themselves, they will bear a disproportionate cost, so that they think about it a lot harder before they launch a cyber operation to begin with. That's what we want to do, number one. And number two, I think we have to think of it in asymmetric terms. They look at us in asymmetric terms. They don't say, well, here's the cyber battle space over here, and here's everything else over there. We can respond to a cyber attack with a non-cyber retaliation, and they need to understand that too. So the point that we want to make publicly, and what we can talk about, is that we are prepared to undertake, we are right now undertaking offensive cyber operations in connection with defending the integrity of our electoral process and defending the overall integrity of our information technology systems. And our adversaries better know that, and they better understand it.
And just highlighting the good parts, do you see any adversary reaction so far?
Well, I think it's too soon to tell. I think part of this is getting the word out that this is not the Obama administration. And although you might think they would have figured that out by now, it never hurts to stress your brand. And every once in a while, I think when somebody notices that something's gone wrong, they'll say, the good old days are gone, aren't they?
Right. Final question for me is, what's the role, our executive director mentioned the religious liberty and inside the national security strategy, and your laying of a wreath for a dissident. What is the role of human rights, in both as a tool of great power competition, but also as an intrinsic good in itself, in your view, in our national security policy?
Well, I think it's obviously a critical element. That's why it's in the strategy. You know, I was one of the original members of the Commission on International Religious Freedom when it was established back in 2000. So to me, it's always been an important part of the policy. And I think you have to look at it as part of the objectives that America seeks. We don't disguise, and we shouldn't disguise, and we shouldn't apologize for what our system does for freedom around the world. We've got a lot of allies who are not in the same position we are. That's not a valued judgment on them. That's a question of their own development and choice. And we've got to keep the real objective in mind here, which is to protect American interest and those of our friends and allies around the world.
I was kidding before. I have a final question.
I know how this works.
Yeah.
I've seen this before.
Right. That was kind of a tee up to the final question. We're in a great power competition. You were certainly a staunch Reaganite and a Cold Warrior. Information, U.S. Information Agency, information campaigns, strategic information operations were so key. We don't really have that capacity anymore. Do you believe there's a need for something like that, a new USIA? I mean, not to suggest new bureaucracy, but some kind of capacity that can go to the diplomatic level rather than tactical level?
I think it's absolutely critical. I think it's a sad commentary on the last two administrations, how much our capabilities have atrophied, and I think we have to think long and hard about how to restore that. In terms of where it should be, I've been in the Agency for International Development. I've been in the State Department and what used to be the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. So in terms of where to put it, I would put it in the State Department. I think that's where it should be. But this is a case where Congress needs to work with the administration to make some pretty fundamental changes in the structures we have now.
Hey, thank you. Well, we're going to open it up to a few questions. There's a big crowd out here, so we're going to keep the press for last. I think that's what Gabe said. So if you can ask your question quickly, so others say who you are, or just ask your question quickly, and so we can get everybody's questions in. Thanks. Shay, back there. Go ahead.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for being here. I'm with the SAIS chapter and formerly Arizona State chapter. My question is that Clausewitz said that war was one of instruments of politics to achieve policy. Now, not going to war has itself become the policy to many Americans, the policy objective to many Americans and policymakers, which has decreased our deterrence level. Do you think this is an issue? And if so, does the administration have any plans to fix this problem, maybe by a successful use of force to demonstrate their willingness and change of course? To put it in academic levels, are we going to war anytime soon?
Well, to put it in practical political levels, no. You know, this is, if I were back in a think tank environment, I'd be happy to have a discussion on that. If I tried to respond to your question in the serious way that your question deserves, the press in this room would be writing stories, every one of which began with war.
Right.
You know,
We'll let them have that chance later.
Yeah, that's somebody else will ask another question. But the point of a peace through strength approach, obviously, is precisely to avoid getting into a hostile confrontation. And it's one reason why you need a strong military. It's one reason why you need the kinds of budget increases that the president has proposed. But it's also has to do with your diplomatic posture and what you expect and what you insist on in the conduct of your adversaries. And I think for far too long, we have encouraged the possibility of military action by our adversaries and their surrogates because of our weakness, our military weakness and our diplomatic weakness. Let me give you a case study from the past week, the INF Treaty. It is beyond question a view shared by every NATO ally that Russia's in serious breach of the INF Treaty. That they've been in breach for 6 years, if not more. This was the view of the Obama administration, repeated publicly in their compliance reports to Congress, and amplified by this administration, including most recently Secretary of Defense Mattis briefing the defense ministers at NATO a few weeks ago. But the response of the Obama administration to palpable violations of the treaty was simply to keep talking. Now, we're at a point in terms of Russian violations where the president has decided that we're going to get out of the treaty. And people have said, oh my goodness, can't you just try and bring the Russians back into compliance? Well, let's review the bidding on that diplomatically. The American position is the Russians are in violation of the treaty. The Russian position is they're not in violation of the treaty. So let me ask you this. How do you bring the Russians back into compliance when they don't think they're out of compliance to begin with? That's the reason the president made it unmistakably clear about 10 days ago that we're going to withdraw from the INF Treaty. And I think that would be entirely justifiable if I didn't even have to mention the word China. I could also mention words like Iran and North Korea. And the reason is that leaving aside some of the other successor states of the Soviet Union, the only two states bound by the INF Treaty are Russia and the United States. Now, it's our view that, as I say, the Russians have violated. They've already withdrawn from the INF Treaty by their violations. So that leaves one country bound by the INF Treaty, and we're sitting in it. Think about that for a minute. If we had successfully launched an effort 10 or 12 years ago to bring China into the INF Treaty, to universalize it, we might be in a different circumstance. But is there a person in this room who really thinks China will destroy as much as half of their ballistic missile capability to come into a universalized INF Treaty? So the diplomatic response to repeated treaty violations, the diplomatic response to other countries taking advantage of not being bound by the treaty's obligations, the response by the Obama administration was zero. So what encouragement does that give to our adversaries? It says, cheat and succeed. Don't enter into treaties with the United States and succeed. And what we're going to say is, if you're in a treaty with the United States, we're going to abide by it. We have more lawyers per capita at the Pentagon than any other defense ministry in the world. We couldn't violate a treaty if we wanted to. Anybody else who wants to sign a treaty with the United States is going to adhere to it. or there will be consequences.
Just quickly before I turn to Arvind, on the INF, how soon would we then be able to build our own cruise missiles, or, well, cruise missiles, I guess?
Well, we have, this is one of the reasons why the INF Treaty is really a relic of the Cold War, because air or sea-launched cruise missiles right now are not in violation of the treaty if they're in the Baltic Sea. But if you put them on the ground in Europe, then they're in violation of the treaty. So it really wouldn't take that much in terms of research and development. We're already underway. That's permitted under the treaty. At some point in due course here, we'll give formal notice of withdrawal and material breach, and then we'd be in a position not to comply with the treaty. But that's really going to follow here, as I say, in due course.
Well, as they say in China, we're going to hurt a lot of feelings with the Chinese people in doing so. But Arvind, go ahead.
Yeah, staying on China, how closely intertwined is the national defense strategy as concerns China along with the economic strategy? Because right now the whole leadership seems to be focused on kind of fixing the Vision 2025 China plan, which is more about the economic side than about the defense side. And how much of an alliance approach are we using in that? Because it seems on the economic side, by tearing up the TPP, which was really an anti-China trade treaty, we've kind of left our allies a little bit out of the picture. So is this a go-alone strategy, or how is that going to be done?
Well, look, on TPP, let's be clear. Hillary Clinton said she would get out of the TPP too. So of the two major contenders in the United States in 2016, neither one of them believed in TPP. Now, Hillary may not have been telling the truth. I mean, I just throw that out as a possibility. I think she would have withdrawn from it as well, or withdrawn from the negotiations. Look, I think that the tariffs that the Trump administration has imposed really are an economic version. The tariffs imposed on China, an economic version of what we've just done with the INF Treaty. I remember vividly the arguments made when China came into the WTO that by bringing it into the WTO, international norms would pressure Chinese behavior, that things would change, and they would become a more market-oriented, rules-based society. Instead, for nearly 20 years, they've continued to steal our intellectual property. They've engaged in forced technology transfers. They've discriminated against foreign trade and investment, both in their own internal economic decisions and their judicial decision. And Donald Trump called them on it and said, you're not going to get away with it anymore. For all the other disagreements we have with Europe on some of these economic issues, they feel the same pain from Chinese behavior on IP and technology transfer and the rest. And I'd say our assessment is that China's amazed at what the Trump administration has done. What are these people doing? We're not getting away with it anymore. That's not in our game plan here. We're looking through the pages, and they're not supposed to do this. They're supposed to sit back and take it. And I think it's caused a lot of hurt feelings, as Dan said, inside China, that we're not a well-bred doormat anymore. And I think it'll produce some changes in behavior.
Got a question back there.
And I might say I am a free trader, unlike Alexander Hamilton, the great proponent of tariffs to protect infant American industry, just for what it's worth.
That was just to get things going.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Go ahead. You can speak loud if you can speak loud. Yeah, go ahead.
Catherine Bato from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I had a question on North Korea. Back in February, you wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about first strike on North Korea and the justifications for that. And I'm wondering how your thinking on that has changed or not, especially if if this period of engagement ceases and negotiations are no longer ongoing. What do you think about military options?
Well, you know, I've written and said a lot of things over the years, and I still believe every one of them. But I don't compare what I said back when I was a free spirit with what I say now as the National Security Advisor, because obviously I'm in a very different kind of place. I give my advice to the president, and he decides what he's going to do. That's why I like to say I'm the National Security Advisor, not the National Security Decision Maker. We're launched on a particular course here with North Korea. The president's determined and optimistic he can see it through. Mike Pompeo has been working as hard as anybody I know can work on this, and continues to do so. And that's the course we're on. And you know, if we could get North Korea to denuclearize, in a serious and permanent way would be a huge achievement, and it would warrant Donald Trump getting the Nobel Peace Prize.
I'm tempted to ask if you were a think tanker. What would you be writing about in North Korea right now? But I won't do that.
You sneaky devil.
Yeah. We can open up to Josh Rogan. I guess the rules are press can speak now.
Thank you very much. Josh Rogan, Washington Post. Thanks for your time. Thanks for your service. Next week, the Trump administration will impose new crippling sanctions on Iran and the Iranian economy, including secondary sanctions, countries that refuse to significantly reduce their imports of Iranian oil. The two top countries that are importers, China and India, have said very clearly they're not going to do that. Also, Turkey and Russia may not cooperate. Are you going to sanction them or give them waivers? And either way, how do you presume to get Iran back to the table to get a better deal than Obama got if the pressure is less than what Obama was able to achieve? Thanks.
Well, I think the pressure that's been exerted by the sanctions that are already in place and by the threat of these sanctions coming back into place has already had a greater effect on Iran even than the sanctions with Europe under the Security Council resolutions. And I think that because sanctions were imposed over a period of years on Iran in a gradual fashion, and the Iranian regime was able to react to those sanctions, mitigate the effects, and kind of hunker down and work their way through it. When the nuclear deal took effect in 2015, I think the sanctions came off and the Iranians said it's a new era. They forgot all their mitigation techniques. They weren't hunkered down. So when we reimposed the sanctions, they weren't ready for it. And I don't think they're ready for it now. I think you can see the consequences in the continuing collapse of the Iranian currency and the demonstrations that began before we left the deal back in December of last year, but continue all around the country. I think it's really a very different environment than before. Now, in terms of how we deal with the specific imposition of the sanctions coming next week, the President said unmistakably our goal is maximum pressure, and that it would be to drive Iranian oil exports to zero. We understand, obviously, a number of countries, some immediately surrounding Iran, some of which I just visited last week, others that have been purchasing oil, may not be able to go all the way to zero immediately. So we want to achieve maximum pressure, but we don't want to harm friends and allies either. And we're working our way through that. I think it's important that we not relax in the effort. And I think already you see reduction in purchases in countries like China that you wouldn't have expected, countries that are still in the nuclear deal. We've also seen Chinese financial institutions withdrawing from engaging in transactions with Iran. European businesses are fleeing the Iranian market. Most of the big ones are already out. So I think the consequences continue, and I think if you just look at the behavior of Iran in the non-nuclear area, you saw the conspiracy to attack an Iranian opposition rally in Paris, resulting in the arrest of several Iranian diplomats who are really Iranian intelligence agents. You saw in this country a couple months ago indictments against Iranian agents who were scoping out Israeli targets and Jewish targets in America. And just yesterday we saw the Danish government announce the arrest of more Iranian intelligence officials planning an assassination in Denmark. So I think the awareness that this regime was not fundamentally changed by the 2015 nuclear deal, that it failed in its foundational premise, that if you could only solve the nuclear issue, everything else would be resolved. I think the pressure is growing. I think people understand there has to be fundamental change in behavior of the Iranian regime to get them to come back to the table. And that's what they're after. And just to be clear, when the President says maximum pressure, I read maximum pressure to mean maximum pressure.
We had a question over here. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Erin O'Malley with Fox News. I was just wondering if you could just say one thing. What is the top item on the agenda for the President's meeting with Putin next weekend?
Well, it's going to be, I think, in Paris at the Armistice Day celebration, likely to be brief. It looks like there'll be other opportunities, but You know, the reason that he has sent me twice to Moscow and to meet with my counterpart on other occasions is that he thinks that despite all the political dust in the air in this country about interference and collusion and so on, that it's important to have sustained diplomatic engagement with them. That's the reason he went to Helsinki. That's the reason we're still talking about it. And there are a lot of issues to discuss. The INF Treaty is certainly one of them. We have other arms control issues, but we've got their behavior in the Middle East, in a whole range of other areas that it's important that we continue conversations on.
Let me just ask a follow-up. Not to obsess about China, but that's what I do for a living. What was did Putin or anyone else that you talked to in Russia have any reaction to your suggestion that perhaps there should be more talks about a common approach on some strategic issues related to China?
Well, it was less a suggestion to have a common approach than to talk about what it means to see China in its current pursuing its current policies, which in the South China Sea are near belligerent in many respects, and in the East China Sea engaged in behavior that's very troubling to Japan, Taiwan, and others, troubling to India in their part of Asia, troubling to the Central Asian republics. So I think it's important to have that conversation, and if you're not speaking with the Russians at a senior level, you can't really do that.
Okay, I think this gentleman was very patient.
Yes, Mohammed, on France 24. First of all, let me congratulate you. Mustache looks good on camera.
That's why he kept it.
Well, that helps me for the white balance at least. But
anything I can do.
The Iranians, the Iranians in the 4th of, we wait in the 4th of November for a big market change on the oil business, on the oil markets, prices, and how much does Saudi Arabia would play a role to establish the market first. Second, for the Danish operation that was countered by the Swedish and the Danish intelligence, do you think that will help you to convince your counterparties in Europe to take a better approach or a pro-American approach toward Iran?
Well, with respect to the oil market, one of the things that the administration has done that the Obama administration did not do was attempt to encourage other producers to alter their production to make up for drops in output from Iran. Now, there are chemical differences in oil, and refineries have different capabilities, so it's been an interesting exercise, but I think we have been able in a number of cases to find alternative sources for purchasers of Iranian oil to be able to engage. We're looking for others. We think we'll have more success there. And that both stabilizes the international price of oil and eliminates the need for countries to rely on Iran. In terms of the terrorist behavior of Iran, you know, Ronald Reagan designated Iran as the first state sponsor of terrorism. And what they're engaged in now is just outright terrorism as a state itself. They're not sponsoring terrorism. These are terrorist attacks that they're planning. So I think our friends in Europe take a look at this, and I think it's unfortunately persuasive evidence for our point that it's not just the nuclear threat of Iran, and that one of the mistakes of the Iran nuclear deal was that it didn't address the other aspects of Iran's malign behavior in military terms and in its involvement in terrorism.
Quickly on that point, no one's asked about Saudi Arabia yet. So the question about Iran and Saudi Arabia, I mean, here's for greater educational purposes at the Alexander Hamilton Society. We have clear national security interests with respect to Saudi Arabia and keeping Saudi Arabia on our side in a Iran coalition in the Gulf, but we also have human rights concerns. And how do you see that balance playing out in real time?
Well, we've said unmistakably to the Saudi government, the President has, Secretary Pompeo has, I have, others have, that we expect them to get to the bottom of this. We expect there to be accountability for what happened, which was criminal without any question, and they have promised to do that. And They have gone a long way already, and we'll see what the next steps are. But as the President has said, this is a very important relationship. It goes back to Franklin Roosevelt, and it has significance not just in the issue of Iran, but in a wide variety of other ways as well.
Okay, this woman over here, please.
Thank you. Elise Labott with CNN. Thank you for your remarks, Ambassador. If I could follow up on Saudi Arabia. Obviously, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi has kind of brought to light some of the concerns that the U.S. has had with the leadership in Saudi Arabia, not just on human rights, but on Yemen and their actions in Yemen and the situation with Qatar. And I was wondering, in light of that, is there a larger discussion with Saudi Arabia right now about the whole actions of Saudi Arabia and how that relationship is going to go forward? Obviously, as you said, there are a lot of strategic interests involved, but there are also a lot of concerns that, you know, I think haven't been addressed and now might be an opportunity to have a wider discussion. Thank you.
Well, you mentioned Yemen. I mean, I think Secretary Pompeo and Secretary Mattis both put out statements on that yesterday. And I think there are a whole range of issues, obviously, we do discuss with the Saudis. I also think it's important to look at the records of other countries in the region, which are not, many of those regimes, not filled with Jeffersonian Democrats. So you can be upset about the human rights record of an American friend, but that doesn't mean that our adversary's human rights record is any better. And just to recall what Jeane Kirkpatrick said about that in her famous article and commentary, the possibility of change in the right direction is far more present in our allies than in some of our adversaries.
Let's wrap up with this because we've run out of time, I believe, or we're about to. About 2 years left, 2.5 years at least for this term. And what would you say, looking back after a few years as National Security Advisor, if you could achieve 3 things, what would they be? And what would you call them? Call those a win, a successful term?
Getting out of the Iran nuclear deal, getting out of the INF treaty.
Okay.
Number 3, to be determined.
All right. Well, thank you so very much, Ambassador Bolton.
Glad to be here.
This is such a great thing for our students and for the Alexander Hamilton Society in general. And we really enjoyed you coming by and speaking with us.
It's my pleasure. Good luck to the Society. It's a great organization.
Thank you. You guys figured out your furniture situation? Oh my God. Did you hear about it? No. We've got it. Everybody on that.
I think we're good to go whenever you go.
Okay. Tracy, we taking a picture? All right.
Thank you. Really good. Oh, good.
Eamon, come on.
How are we doing, Tracy?
Yeah.
Long time. How you been?
Long time. You remember, we actually shared.
We flew to Europe with Pal and went one trip. How much damage did I do?
No, but we're just curious about the remarks on cyber, offensive cyber. If you're doing offensive cyber, you're smiling, you're smiling.
Ambassador?
How impactful can it be?
Sorry about the mustache, but I asked you the same question in 2009 front of the UN. You remember? Now it's better.
It was just the same color then.
Ellen, first I have to congratulate you for the nomination.
Well, thank you.
And you remember one day when we were friends of the UN and they had you for like half an hour at France 24. Right. So you made you for and I said no.
I was right too. Good to see you.
Always right.
Say hi to everybody.
I'm okay, how are you? I'm doing good. Thanks. See you again. Nice to see you. Sound like my Sorry there, man. Sorry.
I appreciate it. Thank
It's classified. Yeah. So we're going to say that it doesn't rise to anything, any approvals that would be involved in this. The possibilities of regular decision
Yes.
so that cyber doesn't affect
I will hear it. Okay.
Depends on what it is.
Okay.
Hey, John.